Thank you again for joining us. So for those of you who have ever joined me for a presentation before, we're going to go to our presentation outline. So we're going to jump ahead. We're going to look at the presentation outline because I think it is really important for everyone to have a full sense as to what we are going to talk about during the course of the presentation. That way you can ask your questions in the chat and I like to respond to them usually in mid-presentation while we are dealing with the topic that's at issue. If you'd prefer, however, you can save questions till the end, but I'm always happy to respond to them in real time. So Anne, let's jump to that presentation outline. We're going to start with defining diversity and inclusion. You might be thinking, Jan, come on, Tanya, I've attended dozens of these before. You know, there's some elements as this evolves and as we see ways in which companies are faltering or failing and ways in which they can be more successful in this arena, that we go back to foundational discussions about ways in which success can be achieved. We're then going to talk about the most common legal challenges, just generally, a quick overview. We're going to talk about communicating diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges and the commitment that an organization has there. We're going to talk about reducing pay equity claims. We're going to talk about affirmative action plans. We're going to talk about both affirmative action plans that are required under federal contracts or based off of work you do with state or federal governments. And then we also have left a little bit of time at the end for questions. So Anne, let's jump right into defining diversity and inclusion. So here's the thing that it is really important for all of us to remember. Inclusion doesn't occur unless you've got a diverse pool of applicants for positions. So it starts even before applications are reviewed. But in order to have a successful diversity and inclusion program, you have to have a culture within the organization that is going to permit this type of environment to occur. And when I say permit it to occur, that's not just, we communicate our commitment to it. There's increasing studies about the important link between well-being within your organization and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if you are only focusing in on DE&I initiatives, but you're not also simultaneously working on employee health and well-being initiatives, it is likely that your DE&I initiative is going to be unsuccessful. Organizations with diverse workforces, you all know this, enjoy increased financial performance. They see more innovation and creativity. They see decreased attrition and related costs. But efforts that address DE&I in the workplace are typically disconnected from those aimed at supporting employee health and wellness. So in order to enact meaningful change in the lives of our employees, it's going to be critical for our business leaders, and that's going to be people not just in your C-suite and at the upper tiers of management, but all the way down front, forward-facing, direct on the floor managers, to really focus in and address total well-being. And that's going to include physical, mental, emotional, and financial health. It's going to include work-life balance. It's going to include concepts regarding social equity and a well-being kind of concept or mindset within the organization's culture is going to be a central strategy in order to ensure that employees can contribute their best while also navigating all the challenges that impact how specifically diverse employees live, work, and relate to other people within the organization. So if the organization fails to address the intersectionality between employee well-being and DE&I, they're doing a disservice to employees, and they're honestly probably not seeing success or traction with their programs. So what is a culture that is going to be helpful in creating an effective DE&I program? You're going to look at your recruiting. We talked about inclusion starts before applications are even reviewed. Where are we recruiting from? Is it always the same colleges or universities, or are we always publishing job ads in the same location or on the same website. Those are things you need to consider as you look at your culture and how you want to expand or change and help these DE&I initiatives become successful. What types of benefits do we use to entice applicants? We're going to talk about this in a lot more detail, and we're talking about pay equity concerns, but these are things, especially in today's job market, that you're going to want to keep at top of mind. Are we supporting efforts for diversity and inclusion in the community? The more you tout a position of diversity and inclusion, the more your applicants are going to ask for proof as to how you're living up to this. So supporting efforts within the community is going to be one really good way to make sure that you are living this lifestyle that you're portraying to applicants. Another thing would be having art of minority artists within the walls of your organization, contracting with minority subcontractors. Those are all ways in which you can additionally show your support for DE&I efforts. There's also going to be some things that you're going to want to do in order to make sure that they don't happen again in the future. And one of those things is deleting the term "not a good culture fit" from your vocabulary, okay? Not a good fit goes back to not like me. It goes back to there's something different about this individual. If there's truly an issue with the person's performance or behavior, identify exactly what that is. This person is not a strong communicator. This person is not a service-oriented individual, and we are a service-oriented firm or organization. The next thing, and this is something that I hate that I'm going to just kind of talk about in passing, that we're going to spend a minute on, when really I want you to spend a couple hours really thinking about this question. And the question is, what is professionalism? We see an expectation of professionalism in a lot of jobs. We see it on job descriptions. We see it in employee handbooks. It's discussed. A lot of times when we're having interactions and discussions with managers about why this individual may not be working within the organization from a standpoint of corrective action. But if you have one definition of professionalism in your organization, you likely are not seeking inclusion. Instead, you're seeking assimilation, okay? And that's really important. So asking the question, am I seeking inclusion or am I seeking assimilation, is important. Other questions you should be asking yourself about this: how am I contributing to a culture of conformity? Is that conformity necessary to perform the job duty or responsibility that is necessary in this position? In some cases, if you're making widgets, conformity is going to be really important, making sure that all the widgets conform. But in more and more jobs now, we expect conformity when conformity isn't necessary, and it could create further growth. It could create more employee satisfaction with the position when they're given that space in order to either perform the task in a way in which they believe effectively accomplishes the end point, or to otherwise kind of be their own person. There's other things that you should be considering as an individual, and this would not be as a company-wide kind of discussion, but how are your beliefs about professionalism aligned with the organization's values? So what is professionalism to you, and how does that compare to the organization's values? How do your unconscious biases impact the ideas or beliefs that you have about professionalism? And then how do my beliefs about professionalism support the growth and development of others? These are all really important questions that we need to be asking ourselves when we are considering inclusion as a larger concept, right? A recent Harvard Business Review article noted that the 3 best ways to be more inclusive, and this is from an individualized standpoint, but remember, inclusion isn't created by a policy, it's created by people. So when I say, here's the 3 things you can do, It's because we can have a policy of inclusion, but if we're not acting in an inclusive environment, it's not going to be successful. So the first step is called instrumental assistance. And what that means is helping colleagues, and helping doesn't have to be doing their work for them, but instead providing endorsements for the work that they do, offering advice, providing information, making introductions to other people or resources to assist them in performing their job duties or functions. So that's known as instrumental assistance and is really important in creating inclusion. Taking emotional care of each other. So having authentic interest in peers' personal lives is the second element that really helps to create an inclusive culture. And then the third element is physical connections. And I know that there is a large group of you out there right now who attend these presentations very regularly, and they're saying, hold up, Tawny, for the last decade, you've been telling me not to physically touch other employees at work, that hugs can be high risk, and we're certainly not kissing at work. Here's the thing, physical connection does not mean physical touching, okay? So I'm not talking about hugging, I'm not talking about kissing, I'm talking about micro acts of interpersonal inclusion, okay? If you have a remote work set up right now, not having a firm screen behind you, but inviting people in to see the workspace in which you have is one micro way in which you can connect with other people, because they can see your background, they can comment on the art on your wall, those type of things. Taking walking together to meetings. So how many times have you gone to a meeting and another colleague who sits in the same area is going to the same meeting, but you both go separately? The act of going together, waiting for that other person, having that other person wait for you, creates a more inclusive environment. Sitting next to or choosing, sitting with somebody at a meeting who may be part of whatever the presentation is going to be or has similar experiences. Those are all micro acts, but that help to create a more inclusive environment. So really, when we're talking about professionalism, as a subset of inclusion, go back to that question. Are you creating inclusion or assimilation? Now that goes to retaining talent. So how do we keep diverse employees? Well, we just talked about some of the ways in which you can have a more inclusive environment. So instrumental assistance, taking care of each other, those physical connections, and get rid of it's not us, it's them viewpoint. It's truly fatal. We should be auditing why people are leaving us. If it is for financial reasons, fine. If it is because a partner or a spouse is moving to another area of the country, fine. But in a lot of cases, there is an element that has to do with our own organization that we have to take into account and recognize in these situations. And can we go to the next slide? So combating bias is really at the forefront of this, right? So manager training is so important here, and we have to upskill our managers. In large part, most managers have expressed that they feel ill-equipped to address the mental toll that social unrest takes on their team. So when we're talking about DE&I, a lot of times we're talking about social justice movements, and this takes a toll on our employees. So 45% of employee experiences of inclusion are explained by manager inclusive behaviors. So for employees who feel as though they are employed at an inclusive environment, 45% of those individuals say that it feels inclusive because of how their manager acts, okay? So this is really critical to make sure that we're training managers in these concepts. And I want to talk about three specific areas that we should focus on here. One is just-in-time feedback to employees. So statistically, research shows that managers are more likely to give actionable and in-the-moment feedback to men over women. And similar dynamics have been observed based off of race, ability or disability status, and sexual orientation. And we know that employees who aren't given actionable feedback are less likely to become aware of areas for improvement, and then they can't leverage the benefit of that feedback. And oftentimes they will then get frustrated when it's brought up later in a performance review. They'll feel as though they're not being recognized for their work. There'll be negative outcomes, which will reduce engagement. It could potentially create some imposter syndrome and maybe even result in turnover. So make sure that we have managers who are giving just-in-time feedback, regardless of protected class status. And before that feedback is given, managers should be asking 3 questions of themselves. Is the feedback that I'm about to give based on subjective criteria and biased expectations? So checking their bias before the feedback's given. And this is all happening in seconds, right? Is this feedback aligned with the requirements of the role and a business need? Or is it something randomly that I expect based off of my own definition of professionalism, like we talked about on the last slide? And then, am I expecting employees to assimilate unnecessarily? Okay, see how all of these build on each other. Next, another element that we can help with managers is to reframe how we offer support to employees. So rather than asking employees, how can I help? Okay, remember, this puts the emotional burden on the employee. Instead, there's ways in which it can be reframed. So you can offer specific support. I'd like to help support you right now. I'm happy to take point on this meeting. Would that help? Okay, that can demonstrate that you care, and it can help relieve stress and anxiety. At the same time, however, do not be removing essential job functions. You're looking to lessen kind of a load during a period of stress or anxiety, whether that's because of social injustice or because of some other personal issue. These are ways in which to create a more inclusive environment, but also simultaneously being mindful that you're not taking underperforming employees and taking job duties and tasks away. Additionally, active listening. If your managers haven't gone through an active listening seminar, I'd highly recommend it, because so often when I'm talking to managers after we're dealing with a disciplinary issue or other performance concern, I'll say something and they'll say, well, they may have said something about it, but I'm not sure, okay? Active listening to our employees is really important. And then finally, manager self-reflection. And that's going to be making sure our managers and each of us are asking the question, what beliefs, biases, or mindsets are driving my behavior? And do these behaviors support the values of the company? Let's jump to the next slide. Even diversity, equity, and inclusion and human resources professionals make mistakes. And there are times in which efforts to model inclusion or allyship don't always kind of deliver the intended impact, and you inadvertently hurt and alienate others. It's important that when you use common terms and phrases that you understand the history around them. These are some common words and phrases that have derogatory histories and that you need to be mindful of and take out of your vocabulary. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you do need to understand their existence. Let's go to the next slide, because these are some other phrases that you should be mindful of and excluding from your vocabulary. One of the ones here that I often get some pushback on is, it was just a joke. Well, if you have to identify for someone that it was a joke, it probably crossed the line and it wasn't funny. Sometimes, yeah, it faltered, it didn't hit the way that you expected it to be, but likely that means that the joke was inappropriate. The other one is, it's no big deal. You'll see that in the first column. Clearly, if you're talking about it with the employee's brought it to your attention. To them, it is a big deal, and it's not helpful to minimize how they feel about the topic. So with that foundation of DE&I concepts and ways in which we can improve ourselves and our management team, let's jump to the most common legal challenges that we see. The first one is marketing a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion without violating Title VII or state fair employment practice rules. So in Maine, that's going to be the Maine Human Rights Act. In Massachusetts, Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination and the rules under Section 149. So making sure that in our communications and the ways in which we market our commitment, we don't unintentionally violate one of these statutes. The next most common legal challenge is pay equity claims, times in which we see that individuals are being paid more or less as a result of a protected classification. And then finally, affirmative action plans that many organizations are instituting despite not having a legal obligation under OFCCP rules. So let's jump to the next slide. And why? Why is a huge question. I ask myself why a lot throughout the course of the day, whether or not it's related to DE&I matters, similar to what this presentation is about, whether it's related to litigation or just questions with clients. There's something that drives all of us, whether or not it's in an individual setting or as an organization, and we need to be asking that why question more. Why are we having such difficulties in implementing successful DE&I programs, okay? And it's important to understand the general barriers that inhibit equal employment opportunity. And this list is one that was created by the EEOC after significant dialogue with different organizations, employee groups, large employers, small employers, government entities. And this list of 7 different kind of concepts is really important in my mind. The first one is one that we talk about a lot. It's the like me syndrome, okay? It's human nature that people like to associate with other people who are like themselves because it enhances their comfort level and their working relationship. And this like me bias, it can be conscious or unconscious, but it leads to a tendency to employ and work with people who are similar, whether that is in race, color, national origin, religion, age, all those things. It can lead to bias and an unwillingness to employ individuals who are dissimilar from oneself. It also can influence an employer's assessment of the norms of performance. That's the way it's always been done. That's the way I had to do it. Those type of things can be problematic, especially when a manager is reviewing a subordinate's performance in a role that manager previously held. Stereotypes is a second general barrier, and this comes as no surprise, but all people have stereotypes based off of race, color, religion, national origin, and they can be negative and erroneous, or they can be positive. And they can affect targeted employees, and they breed subtle racism, sexism, prejudice, and discomfort. And they sometimes are used as a factual basis for employment discrimination. So if you ever hear a stereotype that's given factually, asking for proof and evidence of that quote unquote fact is really important. Additionally, when you have people who are making stereotypes that are positive, that are going to attributes that are stereotypical of a gender, or of a race, or an ethnicity, those are also problematic, even though you're putting the individual in a more positive light, in large part because it adversely affects individuals who are non-members of the numerous diverse groups that make up your workplace. Prejudice, unfortunately, we can't have this presentation without acknowledging that prejudice is real and that it is still a large part of our society. There will be situations where there's outright bigotry on the part of your management team against a targeted group, and you should have tools in place that are going to help you to respond to that through policies, practices, behaviors, and training. Another way in which we see difficulties in creating an inclusive and diverse work environment is a perception that there's going to be a loss by individuals who are threatened by EEO opportunities. So a lot of people feel as though if the workplace becomes more diverse, that they will lose something, and it's a direct threat of their own equal employment opportunities. So they become overzealous to protect their own prospects, and that impedes the prospect of others. Ignorance is, in many ways it goes in with prejudice, but it is its own action. In some situations, people just don't know that you can't take certain aspects into effect when making a decision, or refer to individuals and protected classes in certain ways. There's also other barriers. Lack of education, I think, goes close with ignorance, stereotypes, and prejudice. So the more that you learn about these topics, the more those barriers will be broken down. So let's jump into Title VII and Fair Employment Practices rules. So race, gender, sex, sexual identification, sexual orientation, those are all aspects under Title VII that cannot be taken into account, even if you're attempting to take those factors into account in a positive way. So let's say that you have a team that's made up of all white males who are over the age of 40. You cannot then say, we have to hire somebody who is under the age of 40 and who also fits another minority classification. You can't, because it's inappropriately taking protected classifications into account in making a hiring decision. Now, in October 2020, in response to George Floyd's murder and Black Lives Matter movement, the DOL at the OFCCP department, they sent a letter to Wells Fargo, or they sent letters, one to Wells Fargo and one to Microsoft. And it questioned the company's commitment to diversity, because earlier in the summer, both organizations had publicly announced a plan to double the number of Black managers and senior leaders in their US workforce by 2025. Specifically, the OFCCP said that this violated Title VII because it took race into account in hiring and promoting. Now, we're going to talk about voluntary affirmative action plans and ways that you potentially could get around a finding that this violates Title VII, but there are very specific rules and a standard that's going to have to be set so that if you are advertising or marketing a commitment such as this, it's going to have to be based off of a set of previously determined expectations. Making sure that your senior leaders, your COOs, your CEOs, your marketing department understand this is really important, so that you don't get into hot water from a legal standpoint regarding inappropriate marketing materials. So I've just identified a risk. My goal is that I don't just do these presentations and tell you all the risks, but that I also, help to offer, I don't want to say some solutions, but ways in which we can minimize risk. So Anne, let's go to that next slide. First, the term diversity hire should never be used in your organization, okay? If you ever hear an individual within your organization use that term, it should be shut down immediately. Any individual who enters your organization where the terms diversity hire have been attached to their position, they're going to be unsuccessful. They have been set up to fail even before they've started. Additionally, during the interview process, all managers or individuals who are participating in the interview practice should be reminded of appropriate and inappropriate questions and characteristics that cannot be taken into account in determining qualifications for the position. Similarly, when we're determining which managers or interviewees should be part of the hiring decision or part of the hiring team, we should be looking for a diverse group of individuals. In large part, this assists in helping the applicant and potential employee understand or recognize that, hey, we have diversity here, and there's people who either have a similar background who look or have a lifestyle similar to mine who have been successful here at this organization. And that goes a long way for inclusion later in the process. Additionally, the EOC has come out with some really helpful information, which, not to knock the EOC, but I think in the past we've seen some stuff that is very, very broad and not super helpful with specific ways that can be helpful in achieving diversity. And lately there's been some really good postings. So I do always recommend use of that government site for resources. EOC recommends what's known as the SPLENDID approach. And SPLENDID is an acronym for study, plan, lead, encourage, notice, discussion, inclusion, and dedication. The study means that we need to understand why this problem exists. We need to identify that it exists. We need to know the laws regarding the problem, Title VII, the Main Human Rights Act, what our obligations are regarding hiring, recruiting, all of those aspects regarding diversity, and then various barriers to the EOC and diversity, which we talked a few slides about. You're then going to plan. We have to understand our organization's own circumstances. That's going to include our current workforce. It's going to include the demographics of the area in which we operate, which could be local, it could be national, it could be global. Additionally, consider the fact that with remote work, it now is more likely to be on a national basis. We're going to define the problem and propose solutions. And we're also simultaneously going to be developing strategies to achieve those kind of solutions to the problems. Leading, and we've been talking about this a lot, making sure that manager training is encouraged. Senior, middle, and lower management, they all have to be champions for diversity. If the only people from your organization right now who are participating in this presentation are human resources individuals, first, understandable, because there are SHRM credits linked to today's presentation, and you'll get all the information as to how to get those SHRM credits in the email follow-up. And there's also CLE credits. But other managers can also gain and garner helpful information from these types of trainings. And remember, they're free. So afterwards, take this presentation, send it to your other managers to help them understand resources that are available. But everyone needs to be making this a priority. Encourage. We need companies that are encouraging the attainment of diversity. That needs to be at all manager, all supervisor level. And the structure of the business also has to take that into account, making sure that we're providing the resources that are necessary to achieve success here. We have to have communication. Oh, sorry, notice. Look at me, I was forgetting notice. We have to take notice of the impact of our practices and monitor and assess progress. It's interesting, you know, I don't know if anyone else has read, but there's a lot of articles about diversity and inclusion is the one place where apparently a company feels it's okay to fail. If it was any other operational goal, if it was profits, if our losses were significantly higher than what we had expected for the year, there would be ramifications. But when we're talking about ability to maintain diversity, it's not something that we see ramifications within the organizations as to. And in some cases, it's because people who are really bad at diversity and equity and creating inclusive work environment and helping to mold and shape junior team members are oftentimes our highest producers. So senior leaders will allow the bad behavior to continue without understanding and recognizing the impact it's having culturally. But honestly, you need to ensure that there's a corrective strategy that is fair and that's putting accountability on the right shoulders. Discussion. We need to communicate and reinforce that diversity is a business asset in all areas. not just in one location, but in all locations within your organization. Inclusion, everyone needs to be part of this process. DE&I efforts can't just be led by human resources without there being other stakeholders, specifically diverse stakeholders who are part of the process, helping to create the initiative and helping to make sure it's supported from a larger standpoint. And then dedication, stay persistent in this process. I know that burnout is real. I know that, running in circles, it oftentimes feels like running in circles, but in those situations, maybe making smaller, and I say goals, but we're going to talk about what goals you can and can't have is important, but recognizing culturally that that's the best place to start, because once you have diverse employees, if you're unable to keep them, I think that very clearly shows that you have a cultural problem and an inclusion issue. Let's jump to the second big legal concern that we have in this arena, and that's pay equity claims. If you have brought in a DE&I consultant anytime in the last few years, they likely have said at some point in their speech, you could attract and retain more diverse talent, and you aren't because you aren't paying enough or you aren't providing rich enough benefits. Everyone wants, the highest diverse candidate, and your failure to provide them with increased pay or richer benefits or a company car or moving expenses is what's holding you back. The problem is that if you are paying your diverse employees more, you're providing richer benefits, that's a violation of Title VII and most state Fair Employment Practices Act. The market and your ability to attract or to bring in diverse candidates, that's not a defense to a pay equity claim. Similarly, and we see this right now so much based off of how tight the job market is, where people are looking for just employees. They don't have to be diverse candidates, they just need people. And they're offering these sign-on bonuses where you'll get $500 the first, $1,500 total, $500 for the next 3 weeks, or they're not small, hey, here's $100 extra for signing on. We're seeing real money sign-on bonuses. What this is going to do, it's going to create pay equity nightmares, okay? So what happens if you're hired the 3 weeks before this bonus initiative goes into effect? Are you retroactively making sure that these employees are paid the same amount? If not, are you increasing the pay of the employees who had been with you previously? When we are looking at pay equity claims, all funds that are given to the employee are going to be looked at to determine whether or not there's equality between the parties. So let's go to the next slide and talk about how we can reduce pay equity claims. The first thing is to predetermine salary ranges for positions. Having set, this is the range, or if you don't want to say the exact range, at least a mean, like, hey, the average of people in this position is at this place, okay? One of the things that becomes concerning there is your current employees seeing it and then asking for more money. If they should be getting more money, give them the raise before you bring on new employees, because you should have the statistics about the amount of time and energy and money it costs in order to onboard those employees, and retaining the good employees that you have. That increase in pay is going to be a lot less than the onboarding costs associated with hiring that individual's replacement. You're also going to want to assess current pay rates versus market. In doing this, you're not going to want to, even if you have a good, let's say you have a good relationship with competitors, or the human resources professionals at a multitude of other similar organizations in the area, you do not want to say, hey, we're paying 19, is that about what you're paying? And they say, well, we're paying 20. And then you decide, okay, well, we'll pay 22. It's a form, it's not price fixing because there's no price, but it is a violation of the law because you're colluding with other competitors and you're changing the market based off of those discussions. If you want information concerning market pay, use an outside organization that collects that data and information and maybe provides it on an anonymous kind of format. It is the best practice here when you're getting that information. Additionally, you know, if you have contacts at other organizations, right, who can provide you past data, as long as it's not the current data, that could also be helpful. If you make an offer to an employee and that offer is rejected, seek feedback. Get an understanding as to why the offer was rejected. If it was because financially it was nowhere near what they were seeking, that's important feedback. And I'd say, like, what was the range that you were looking for? And is that similar to what you're seeing from other positions of this nature? Get that feedback from your applicants to understand. Maybe you're way below market. That's going to make it that much more difficult for you to attract and retain employees generally, but more specifically, diverse employees. We already talked about the costs associated with onboarding. And then also we're going to want to make sure that we're doing regular pay equity audits. So if you have not performed a pay equity audit in the last few years, it's something that you should regularly be doing. You can do it with an HR consultant. You can do it internally by just, you know, putting time aside and going through the different categories of employees and positions you have and how much they're paid and what their past experiences are. But be mindful that if you're going to do an audit, you need to be prepared and have the financial ability to make changes if a determination is made that there's inequities occurring. If you, before you even perform the audit, have an inkling that there is going to be an issue, I highly recommend involving counsel before you begin the audit so that the audit can be accomplished under attorney-client privilege, and then action can be determined based off of what the findings are. Remember that when we talk about pay for pay equity purposes, we're looking at bonuses, we're looking at raises, all of the finances that go into this are aspects of pay. Now, if the commissions or the bonuses are based off of sales or other performance indicators, and you can specifically show that, and you have some people who are outperforming others, in most cases, that's going to be fine because you can specifically tie it to why the bonus award was made based off of productivity. Let's touch on, in the last 15 minutes, the last topic, which is affirmative action. The first, can we go back one slide? The first thing that we want to talk about is mandatory affirmative action plans. And these are governed by the Department of Labor through the OFCCP. And federal contractors have an obligation to take action to ensure that applicants are employed and employees are treated during employment without regard to race or color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, all the protected classifications, right? And the affirmative action obligation reaches all terms and conditions of employment, very similar to Title VII and other protections, right? So if you are a covered contractor, is how the term's most often used, and you have a certain threshold of employees and that you have contracts that are valued at more than $10,000 or and that's in an aggregate. So let's say you have 5 $2,500 contracts, so your aggregate's more than 10,000, or you have a contract that's valued at more than 15,000, so one contract for $16,000, or you have a contract that's valued at $150,000 or more, and this is under a different provision under VERVRA, which is going to be just a very specific subset of our audience. and if this applied to you, you would have an understanding that it was applicable to you based off of your contracts with the federal government. So what you need to do is you have to provide notice to applicants and employees, the law, and you're also going to have to create a written affirmative action plan, okay, if you have at least 50 employees. So you have to develop and maintain a written affirmative action plan. This is going to consist of you understanding the ethnic race of your population, so both the gender, the race, and the veteran status of your population, the employees that you have, also the applicants who are applying for your position. You're then going to take that data and you're going to process it to determine whether or not you are meeting expectations in hiring and promoting, in having applicants of a diverse background who are applying to your positions within. So census data is then reviewed to see the percentage of individuals who are, a certain minority status in your area, and then how that compares to different job positions that your organization has in that specific location. So that's a mandatory affirmative action plan, okay? And if you currently have one, you should have an understanding of whether or not you're meeting expectations or you're not. And it's separate and distinct from a DE&I program, but it helps to provide you with underlying data as to whether or not your employee base is similar demographically to what the environments you live and work in are. Next is a voluntary affirmative action plan. So we talk a lot about diversity in the workplace, having a diverse group of employees and the ability to choose from a diverse group of applicants. In order to make a job attractive to diverse candidates, some employers under federal law will have to maintain this affirmative action plan, but others can do this more kind of diversity initiative, which is a voluntary affirmative action plan. And can we go to that next slide? The EOC defines workplace diversity as a business management concept where employers voluntarily promote an inclusive workplace. They value diversity to create a culture of respect for individuals, right? The Code of Federal Regulations then specifically notes that affirmative action programs are appropriate if you can show three different standards, all that have a subsection. And that is adverse effects of prior discriminatory practices, and then limited labor pools. And that CFR kind of requirement that's been created has further been analyzed by the United States Supreme Court and said that diversity initiatives often include goals as to how the organization can attract and retain a more diverse group of applicants and employees. But in order to create this plan as to how you're going to attract and retain diverse employees, your diversity initiative has to, one, be remedial in nature, which means that you have to acknowledge that there's been past discrimination or a possible adverse impact as to a group in question. The next thing you have to do is you have to acknowledge that this plan does not unnecessarily interfere with the interests of non-minority employees. And specifically, that means you cannot terminate non-minority employees just to hire diverse employees. And then third and final, the plan or program is temporary in nature with the goal of achieving some type of balance without maintenance, okay? So that means, and the two things that are often most difficult here is one, has to be remedial. So you have to acknowledge that there's an issue within the organization. And two, there has to be an end date. In a lot of diversity initiatives, people are creating them and organizations are creating them in perpetuity. But to have a true voluntary affirmative action program or diversity initiative under the statute, there would have to be an end date, okay? As it relates to prior discriminatory behaviors, this is high risk to acknowledge that there's been this past action or behavior. It is a time that we highly recommend that if you're considering putting together one of these plans, that you talk to an attorney to make sure that you're clear on what language should and shouldn't be used when you're describing the employees' workforce and how you're remedying past discriminatory behavior. Let's jump to the next slide. Football fans or follow the NFL likely know about the Rooney Rule and have likely heard about attempts to create Rooney Rules in more corporate environments. We see it a lot when we're talking about board makeup of an organization and the individuals who make up board of directors of publicly traded companies. But it's a rule that was adopted in 2003 in which the NFL expanded its focus by acknowledging that it has historical low numbers of minorities in head coaching positions. So it originally required every team with a head coaching vacancy to interview at least one or more diverse candidates before making a new hire. So if there were 5 candidates and they were all white men, they wouldn't be able to hire someone until they interviewed a minority candidate, okay? Since 2003, the Rooney Rule has been expanded to more positions outside of the head coaching position. In 2009, it was amended to include general manager jobs and equivalent front office positions. At that time, it was also expanded to require each team to interview at least 2 external minority candidates. It evolved again in November 2020, and there was a proposal in which rewards were given. Teams were rewarded if they developed minority talent. And in 2021, the NFL approved changes requiring every team to interview at least 2 external minority candidates for open head coaching positions and at least 1 external minority candidate for coordinator jobs, and at least 1 minority and or female candidate must be interviewed for senior level positions such as club president and senior executives. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going to have more minorities or women within the organization, but at least the applications are going to include candidates who fall within these parameters, okay? So there's the interviewing versus the hiring. Really what I think this helps with is channels of recruitment. If your organization relies significantly on word of mouth recruiting, it can be problematic because you're getting a channel of recruitment in which you're seeing more people like us, and therefore you don't have inclusion, you more likely have assimilation, and that's decreasing your diversity efforts. If you are doing kind of referral based, making sure that you already have a diverse hiring team would be really important to help make sure this is successful. So let's go to our last slide in the last 3 minutes of the presentation, measuring failure and success. Points of failure is lack of measurable goals. So if you have an affirmative action plan, whether or not it's mandatory or voluntary, having a measurable goal for a certain period of time is going to be important. Communicating to current employees diversity hire, that's another point of failure that we see a lot of, or participating in this diversity initiative. Identifying someone as a diversity hire is not helpful. And then underlying all of this, and most important, is cultural issues. So culturally, what does your environment look like? And I'm not just talking about the emotional cultural aspects, but also the physical space. Is it open and inviting? Does it have diverse artwork on the walls? Those types of comments and concerns ways in which you can be more likely to achieve success, a plan of action to increase diversity of candidates. Manager training definitely should be part of. I mean, if you're going to get diverse candidates without appropriate manager training, you're not going to be able to keep diverse candidates. Accountability is a big issue here. Are you holding correct people accountable when they don't meet the goals that have been set forth? And then training on best practices in diversity, equity, and inclusion topics. A lot of people will hesitate to talk about diversity questions, will hesitate to talk about racial justice concerns, will hesitate to talk about any social justice changes for fear that they are going to misspeak, that they are going to say or write something that is taken to be offensive. And in doing so, they then fail to be true allies and to assist in furthering a diverse and inclusive work environment. So with that, with 1 minute to spare, if anyone has questions, I'm happy to take questions at this time. I appreciate all of your attention. I have one, I know somebody emailed about the link to the presentation, and I apologize if that didn't work. That will, everyone will get a link to the PowerPoint at the either tomorrow or on Monday. So apologies as to that. Not seeing any other questions. Thank you all for your time and attention this morning. I appreciate it, and I hope you stay cool and have a wonderful Thursday. Bye, everyone.